Welcome to Planted, finding your roots in STEM careers. Journey with us as we navigate the winding path into plant-related careers with professionals who have taken root or are still branching out. I'm Megan Wiesbrook.
And I'm Jessica Turner-Scoff.
In this season of Planted, we are exploring the fields of opportunities associated with plant-focused STEM careers. That's right, all the cool industries and places you can work with plants.
Today we're going to be exploring the field of higher education. That's right, we are going to navigate the world of academia. Graduate school to postdocs to tenured professors. This world can be a confusing world, even to someone who has spent years in it. So I'm just really happy we have someone today who can share the ins and outs of this complex process and system.
And we have the perfect guest to do that.
So perfect.
Jessica and I have seriously fangirled over having Dr. Tanisha Williams, a postdoc at Bucknell University. So thank you so much for being here, Tanisha.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
And as a way we like to introduce you to our listeners, we like to list 3 things that kind of seem to have nothing in common, but you are the common thread. So can you tell us how your story links mongooses, geraniums, and hashtags?
Those are really good ones and a lot of good memories. I would say a lot of this stems from my PhD work and research. I did work in South Africa, and the mongoose part of the story is while doing this hike with a lab mate and a student that we brought over. We were in this national park, just walking around, really not too prepared for an intense hike. And then we leave the park and I'm driving out and I see this mongoose keep kind of running in and out of the road. And I was like, oh, wow, what's going on? And the mongoose is fighting a puff adder snake and wins. And so we stopped the car, although I didn't want to stop because I am not a fan of snakes. I think they're wonderful animals, but I don't want to see them up close.
A safe and comfortable distance.
Exactly, behind glass. But yeah, it was an amazing interaction. We got it on video. We've showed it to so many people, and a lot of the South African scientists and that we were working with, they were like, that's an amazing interaction that you caught. We know these things happen, but not too many people have seen it, let alone caught it on camera. So that was the mongoose. The geraniums are what I study in South Africa. I study the genus Pelargoniums, but we all know them as geraniums here in the US. And I just like to put a little fact here for trivia. If it ever comes up that your common geranium is actually a Pelargonium variety from South Africa. And the hashtags would be I am on social media doing a lot of things on social media, in particular Black Botanist Week. That is something that I started with the 11 other Black botanists, and we're using tons of hashtags to bring this movement together.
Well, Tanisha, we are so excited to talk with you. We look forward to hearing the ins and outs of your career, what it's like working in higher education. And Jess and I have been so excited for this conversation. So let's just jump into it.
One of the first things we should talk about is what a career path in higher education can look like. It can be somewhat of an esoteric pathway, and if you aren't super familiar with it, you might not know all of the steps. So, Tanisha, can you walk us through what it looks like from the time you got your undergraduate degree to, where you are now as a postdoc?
Yeah, it's a really long and lengthy process, and one that I'm so happy that we're talking about because it seems like a black box, but if you've been through it, you can help navigate. So for undergraduate, I went to Penn State University. I applied to state universities because of being from Washington, D.C., you can get in-state tuition at a state university. And so that's something that I chose. And then Penn State also had a really good engineering program before I switched over to the light and became a plant scientist and botanist. But I really love engineers. So that's kind of my navigation through the undergraduate degree. I had several internships. I did study abroad during that process, which I highly recommend. There's so many things at the undergraduate level, so many opportunities that you can have that kind of go away as you move further and further up in academia. So I highly suggest that you seek out these programs and counselors and guidance for different programs to study abroad, to study within your community, and get these opportunities. Then after that, I actually worked for 2 years. I knew I wanted to go back to school, but I worked. I kind of figured out what degree I wanted, which was an environmental science degree. So I applied for many different programs, but the reason why I applied to Cal State LA, and I'm so excited that I did, it had 2 tracks, which I didn't see a lot of in programs. So one track was you applied to the program, you get an internship at like an energy company, and you're doing this environmental project, and that oftentimes, like 95% of the time, led to a permanent position. The second track was actually doing research. And so I wanted to do the research track, but I was happy that I had a backup plan. And so I applied to Cal State LA, got in, did the research track, did research on plants throughout, looking at hybridization of poplar trees throughout California and Nevada, and the rest is history. I fell in love with plants and never looked back. And then after my master's degree, I went straight into my PhD. Applied for a lab at the University of Connecticut in their ecology and evolutionary biology department. And that's kind of the schooling portion of it up to my degree. And you have to apply to all these things. And then right after I graduated, I applied to this current position that I'm in now, which is the Burpee Postdoc in Botany at Bucknell University, working with Dr. Chris Martin.
So I know you just did a wonderful job of outlining, all the different steps, all the different, decisions you had to make from undergraduate to your master's program. Can you talk a little bit? I would understand that the field is pretty competitive, and I would imagine that there's application processes along in each of these steps. But can you kind of talk through that process and how it was that you landed in a doctoral program, what it's like applying for a postdoc, information about professorships, because I know it's a pretty competitive process with a lot of different applications to kind of balance.
And I want to preface for our listeners that this is specifically for like ecology biology. There's different academic programs, different fields. There's going to be a different process. Like Megan got her master's, but that was education based, so it's a different experience. So this is really focusing on that biology ecology component.
Yes, that's really good to highlight. My experience is definitely in the biology ecology realm, and every application process is going to be a little bit different. But some of the tips and tricks that I've learned along the way is applying for undergrad was really kind of a grab bag for me. It was just kind of, these are programs that I've heard about, or institutions and colleges that I heard about. They had good fellowship funding. Some of them were state schools, not all of them, but it was more about funding and making sure my SAT scores were good enough to get into certain programs. Then after that step, I took the 2 years off, and in those 2 years, I started to learn how to apply for graduate school. So making sure that you have the GRE, although a lot of schools are taking the GRE off the plate, which I think is a wonderful idea, but saving up for that, because it's really expensive to apply and get into all of these programs. And I'll get back to that point as well. So making sure you have a checklist. That's kind of what I did, a checklist of all the requirements that are due for each of your institutions, and making sure you have the GRE, personal statements. Some of the schools want resumes and CVs. So checking that out. Also for master's program, I didn't have to do this for Cal State LA, but I had to do this for a lot of my other programs, was reaching out. I was told by mentors to reach out to the professors beforehand. So it's not a cold application. You're talking to them about if they have space in their lab. I would also highly recommend that you talk to the students within their lab to see if it's a good working environment, to see if it's a good department and things like that. So asking those questions. So when your application comes across the table for that search committee or the graduate student committee that's looking at that, your professor can say, oh, I know Tanisha, this is someone that I want in my lab. You still have to hit those requirements for the graduate school, the certain GPAs and things like that. But then after you've hit all those things, it's really who's vouching for you in these meetings behind closed doors. So making sure you're building this relationship with your future mentor ahead of time. And what I learned during my master's program is that for certain socioeconomic classes, there is help to help you apply for these applications. I think back in my day, the applications were anywhere from $60 to $100 per school. And that gets really expensive, and you don't apply to like 2 schools, or you could, but I didn't. I applied to, I think, like 8 schools. And so I found out there were programs to help me with this. And so I actually randomly called the admissions office to discuss some, it wasn't even about payment of the application, but the admissions officer noticed my background, and she said, are you paying for all these applications? And I was like, yes. Struggling, but yes, I am. And she was like, you do not have to do this. She was like, you can call each and every one of these institutions and ask for a financial voucher where they will waive your application fee. You have to hit certain marks, or maybe it depends on the institution. But after paying for like 4 of those, I definitely called. And for the Cal State system, there is a program where you can, I think you pay once and you can apply to like all the Cal State systems, which, I mean, there are like 20, 30 schools in that system. So making sure you're talking to people about different assistance program as well, because it is really expensive. So that was for the master's degree. The PhD looked very similar to my master's program. I reached out to professors ahead of time, let them know I was interested in what I was interested in before I applied to any schools. That pool was much smaller than my master's degree. I think my master's degree, I applied to like 8 to 10 schools. For my PhD, I applied to 4 or 5 schools for a PhD. And for the postdoc, I honestly did the same thing. Every application that I applied to, you don't have to pay for these for the postdoc, but every application I applied to, I had talked to the advisor, I had talked to the people that were doing the research to let them know that I was interested and that I'm going to apply to this position.
That's great. And I think it's so important that, it shouldn't be a cold application. Like, you should be communicating with the professor or the mentor well in advance. It also really helps to make sure you're reading their papers, you are understanding their work, you can see how you could fit into that greater picture. And also on top of that, sometimes if you have a conversation with that mentor or advisor, you can actually get your application fees waived or money to come visit the school, which I always think it's so important. If you are pouring your life for like 4, 5, 6 years, you should like where you're going to be living. So that is a huge important component of that as well. Now, did you always want to be a professor? Well, what was your dream job when you were a little kid? What did you think you were going to be?
Not at all. I would say when I was a kid, my dream job was being an archaeologist. Like, I loved being outside, digging up things. And then I know we've talked about this several times, but Jurassic Park was definitely an influence.
Yes.
I was one of those dinosaurs are cool kids. Still am. They're still really cool. And then I think for a small stint, I wanted to be a medical doctor. And then I got stitches and I was like, never would I be able to be a medical doctor because there's blood.
As I always say, there's a reason I work with plants.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, not even animals. Like, oh no. It's kind of funny too that when I applied to my PhD programs, I was co-advised by 2 advisors, and I told them coming in, I was like, I don't want to be a professor. I'm just super interested in just science policy. I'm from DC. I still am. I still do science policy on the side, but I thought I wanted that to be a large component of my job. But as I was finishing up my degree, I I just love research. I love answering questions, and being a professor is one way, not the only way, but it's one way that you can continue to do research and ask these cool questions, as well as mentoring students. So here I am being a professor, and one of my mentors, he does remind me every once in a while. He'll say, "Remember when you came to my office and said, I don't want to be a professor?" And I was like, "I do, vividly." But here I am.
Well, we
Yeah.
certainly want to know more about your current research and kind of, what plants it is that you're studying. We know now some of the background of why you chose plants and maybe not archaeology or medicine. But can you talk a little bit about your current research studying plants? And then also, how did you decide what to research? How did you narrow that decision around this particular species or these particular questions that you wanted to answer with your research?
Yeah, those are great questions. So I will say for my PhD research, I studied the genus Pelargoniums, and I looked at how they respond to climate change throughout South Africa. I did a number of different, using another number of different methods, using herbarium records to look at pests, species responses, using common garden techniques to kind of look at current species responses and how plasticity, or if they're plastic or not, meaning will plants kind of shift their morphology or physiology based on environmental cues, and using species distribution modeling to kind of look at a feature aspect of what the habitats of these plants would look like, and kind of determining will the plants be able to make it to these new habitats if the climate change models are true, which I think they are. And so those questions I had, in the sense of I was really interested, and I just love learning about climate change and how plants and animals are doing these cool things, trying to really adapt to this, just the way we're changing and often destroying the planet, and how how these species are trying to handle and adapt to that. And so that was my ideas coming in. I didn't know that I was going to work in South Africa. I was very, very lucky. Both of the labs had been working in South Africa for over a decade. I came in, I was going to be content with working in Connecticut locally, but I'll never forget the meeting where I was in one of my advisor's office, and I was talking to him about my questions and what I was interested in. And he was like, "We can do that in South Africa." And I was like super shocked. I was like, "Oh, okay," trying to play it cool. And then as soon as I left his office, I was ran to the bathroom and cried because I was so happy. And it would have been that would be the first time that I had made it to the motherland, made it to the continent. And it's something that I've always wanted to do. And so it was special in a lot of ways to make that trip and do the research there. So yeah, so that was just the luck of the lab doing work in South Africa, because it very well could have been anywhere else in the world to do this work.
Well, this is an excellent segue into one of my favorite questions to ask. But listeners will know we like to ask this one a lot. But what are some of the perks associated with your job? And it sounds like travel is definitely one of them.
Yes, that I've gotten to go to a lot of different beautiful places because of my job, because plants are everywhere. So study plants.
Even Antarctica. Even Antarctica.
Yes, there are plants there. I know of some botanists that are doing some work there. It's super cool. So definitely travel. With this new position, this postdoc position, I get to work a lot with undergraduate students and undergraduate researchers, which I really didn't do a lot of because I was traveling so much for my PhD work. So I'm really enjoying the mentoring aspect of this career and seeing the impact you can have on students. I also like the kind of smaller sizes we have here at Bucknell University. It's a liberal arts institution. It's a little bit smaller than what I'm used to, the Penn States and the UConns. And it's just a really nice size for me. I feel like I can really making a difference here. So I really like that aspect. And I love being outside. That is one of the perks of doing botany. You can be a bench scientist as well. in botany, but I love being outside, like looking at new plants, going to these new areas, seeing where they are. That's one of the best parts of the job.
Well, you've almost sold both of us on, describing these perks. It's also been really great to listen to you describe, and you've already given some kind of like nuggets of advice as you've talked through the process and kind of your journey in higher education. But if you could give some additional advice, I'll say, since you've already given us some, but if you could give some advice to somebody who might be thinking about pursuing a career, I know, at first glance, it can look long, but what would you say to somebody who's thinking about this, and what additional advice would you give, to them?
Yeah, I would give the advice of informational interviews, but I normally call them coffee dates. I say you find someone on Twitter, online, at your local institution, botanic garden, wherever you are, in whatever part of the botanical journey or industry you're interested in. Find a person that does a cool job that you're like, oh, hey, I would like to do that job, and ask them how they got there. I have done that, and you find out so much information about different funding opportunities, maybe different graduate programs that you didn't know about. Yeah, definitely informational interviews are a way to go. And that once that person knows your name, if something else comes across their desk, they'll say, oh, hey, remember I had coffee with Tanisha, and she said she wanted to do science policy. So now this scholarship came across my desk. I'll forward it to her. So it's networking, but I think it's a little bit more than going into the conversation thinking that you're gonna get something from a person, or you're just getting more so their life story and their experience, and you never know where the relationship is gonna go.
I think that's great advice. It's part of the reason why we love having these conversations with different people around their background into plant science and horticulture. I also think that a lot can be solved by meeting someone for coffee or bringing chocolate to a meeting. So I think that's definitely some great advice to consider. Tanisha, so part of the Planted audience, in addition to being students, is also teachers. And we've shared your profile, a bit about you, your background, with a group of our educators, and said, if you got to be in our lucky seats where we get to sit and ask you questions, what is it that you would want to ask her? So we have a couple questions from them. If you don't mind, we'll jump right into those.
Yeah.
So I know you've talked about this a little, that you have, both field days or times when you're in the field doing research, and then also times when, you're in the office or on campus. And I also know that no day is typical. No day in my role is typical. No day in Jessica's role is typical. But can you talk a little bit about kind of what like a typical field day, typical office day might look like for you?
Yeah, I'll talk about what we're doing here at Bucknell University in our postdoc. We have kind of like two legs in the lab. We are using genomics methods to update the conservation status of rare plants here in Pennsylvania. And then we have another leg where we're looking at solanum plants, so your eggplants, tomatoes, plants like that. And we're looking at these plants in Australia and doing all different types of aspects of their sexual system, reproductive systems, also looking at the plant-people interactions, how indigenous people are using these plants. And so a day in the office here in my postdoc is that on one leg, I am meeting with students. I am helping them with their projects. I really love that the labs here, students have independent projects. They are moving their science down the line. It's not just we're giving you work to kind of like a part of this larger body of work that is kind of all for the professor. It's like, students can come up with their own projects here, or they can tap into existing work. So I'm helping them move their research along by either teaching them new skills, helping them with extractions, R coding, things like that. I actually do a lot of writing and coding because with science, you do the really fun part, which is going out into the field. I guess you could ask, it depends on the person, what is the really fun part. But for me, the really fun part is going out into the field, collecting the plants, collecting data about it, natural history data and things like that. And then bringing those plants into the lab. Sometimes we're going to do some morphological measurements. Sometimes we're going to do some genomics methods and DNA extractions. And then after that, we're going to do a lot of analyzing data. So I do a lot of writing, a lot of coding, and I actually really enjoyed the coding parts. My favorite days are coding and being out in the field. And so that's kind of what a typical day looks like for me.
If our listeners are interested in learning more about kind of the Australian component of the research working with plants in the tomato family, you can listen to Dr. Chris Martin's episode in season 2. And he is also the creator of the Plants Are Cool Too YouTube series, which we will link to in the bonus content. As we mentioned in the beginning, we associated you with hashtags. And, you are one of the creators of Black Botanist Week on Twitter. Absolutely exceptional. So cool. And I know that our listeners and Megan and I would love to hear more about the importance of representation, because it is so important, and how you developed this movement.
Yes, thank you so much. Yes, I just sent out the first tweet. But yes, Black Botanist Week actually started after a couple movements. So the first movement that I was a part of was Black Birders Week. And that movement was started because of an incident that happened in New York City in the city park. There was an incident where a black birder, asked a woman to leash her dog because that was the rules of the park, and she falsely called the cops on this black man. It was recorded, and so after that, Black birders got together, the community, and said we're gonna support Christian Cooper, and we're gonna make sure that we're visible. Like, there are Black people that are birding. It's not just a white entertainment thing. Like, there are Black people that enjoy this for entertainment, for education as well. And so I was a part of that week, Black Birders Week. That week that went on was during the heighten of the pandemic. That was the first time we were locked down, the stringent lockdown. That was also the week of George Floyd's ceremony. It was just a really emotional, very sad week for me, but in all of that sadness and emotions was Black Birders Week. And I'm not a birder, but the first day was like Black in nature. It was like anyone that likes to be outside, anyone that likes anything about nature, you can participate. And that's how they had me hooked. And I was like, oh my gosh, there's like all these Black people online taking pictures of plants and birds and like just like insects and just like geeking out on loving nature. And I was just interacting with people, finding new people. And I just loved it so much. It brought so much joy to my heart. And so I wanted the same thing for the botanical community. And that's why I sent out this tweet. I was like, is anyone interested in doing a Black Botanist Week? And 11 other Black botanists showed up. They continue to show up. And it's just been a phenomenal journey from there. We're on year 3 of Black Botanist Week. We just had a meeting last week. We are preparing for Black Botanist Week 2022 over the summer. And it's been an amazing ride to just, out of the 12 of us, I've only met 2 of them. There are 2 we have 3 South African members, but I've only met 2 South African members. Everyone else I have only strictly met online. So I cannot wait to get offline for us to finally meet in person. But it's been a wonderful experience to find more Black people that love plants. And that's something that we also wanted to set up in this thing is to change the definition of botany and who you think a botanist is. So our definition is anyone who loves plants. You don't need an academic degree. You don't need to be something. You could have a house plant, and if you love it, you're a botanist. And so that's something we're trying to spread. It's just this love for plants, this love for nature and learning, and to be in part of this this community. Like, we're trying to lift each other up.
I think it's really awesome to this is just such a great example that activism can connect to like other strands and interests. And it can kind of push the movement and representation more to the forefront and kind of keep that conversation going. So it's one of the things that I think is just really important, but also really cool that it keeps, I mean, Jess and I are going to be following along for Black Botanist Week 2022.
Heck yeah.
So I know I just think there are so many things that connect all of us together, and finding those common strands, I think is just, it's so cool. And I think this is a glowing example of that. You did mention that, a botanist is anyone who loves plants. And I also know one of the things that the educators picked up in your profile that we share with them as well is that you also wrote a plant love story, which I think is another super cool project that we're so excited to highlight in the bonus content for this episode. So can you talk a little bit about the connection with African violets and your grandmother and kind of your plant love story?
Yes, it was actually our first Black Botanist Week. Becky from the Smith Conservation Fellows, who is one of the founders of Plant Love Story, she reached out to us and said, like, we would love to collaborate. Like, we're just super excited that this first Black Botanist Week is happening. And so one of our days was actually writing your own plant love stories, and you could submit it to Plant Love Stories. And so I did it because I was actively participating in all of Black Botanist Week. Like my job in my head is to make sure I basically interact with anyone that uses the hashtag during that week. I try to do it outside the week, but definitely during that week, I'm trying to hit everyone. And I wanted to be a part of this really cool day, is reflecting and writing my own plant love story. And so this story, I had to think about kind of what connected me to plants. They've always been a part of my life, but I don't think they were so at the forefront until I started to write this story and think about it. I was like, oh, we went camping, we went hiking, we would get our food from the farmer's market, all these things I'm doing with my great grandmother who raised me. And some other family members, but I was raised by my great grandmother, and I'm like, oh yeah, plants were always there. And in our home, she had this wonderful collection. African violets were everywhere, all throughout, upstairs, downstairs, and every windowsill. We had African violets all over the place. And I just remember as a kid running around, like touching the fuzzy leaves, and her saying, please be careful with those African violets. Like, she wasn't like, don't touch them, but she was just like, just gently, just be gentle. But yeah, and so I wrote this story, which really just kind of brought the forefront of how my great grandmother really weaved in and allowed me to love these plants, allowed me to learn more about plants. But it wasn't like, it was just a part of our everyday being. I never had like a plant class or anything like that. It was just this watching her care for her plants, watching her sing to her plants and things like that, or more like hum, like a nice little humming song as she's watering them. Yeah, so it was a nice way to go down memory lane, connect some dots of how I get this question a lot of like, did you always like plants? And I'm like, yes, yeah, they've always been there in my life. So it was a really nice exercise and also to honor my great grandmother, because she's since passed on, but like to honor her and just remember those times with her and plants.
It's so beautiful. And I know from my own experience in childhood, like, again, plants were always there. Like, I guess to the point that I didn't really see that connection that it could be a career until much later in my life, just because, I don't know, it was just so integrated into the framework of my family and my childhood. So
it feels like furniture in the room almost.
I mean,
sometimes.
yeah, because it's so like, of course you're going to have a plant there. Of course you're going to go to the garden store every year. Of course you're going to go. I mean, it's just that connection, at least with my own personal experience. So, and it's a great, fantastic writer. Highly recommend checking it out in the bonus content. Thinking about, your own plant love story and how plants have helped shaped you, what kind of advice would you give to yourself, like 18-year-old Tanisha, ready to take on the world? What advice would you give if you could?
That's a good one. I think the advice that I would give to myself is to always be open to opportunities, be less afraid, maybe less rigid. I was always a planner, still am, but I do see how being a little less rigid, seeking out different opportunities, which is why I was highlighting for your undergraduate degree, making sure you do study abroad experiences, because you just are learning and meeting new people, different cultures, different plants. It's just like wonderful. Yeah, I went to Peru to the Amazon, and that really was like a eye opener. Like I did research on mahogany trees and my mind was blown when I went to the rainforest.
That's amazing.
I feel like we have talked about so many different plants in this episode that even this last question is going to be probably kind of tough to answer, but it is one that we make all of our guests answer. So whether it's a mahogany tree or an African violet or some of the geraniums that you study, we are going to make you pick just one. But can you tell us what your favorite plant is?
That is a tough one. And I'll say my favorite plant at the moment, like it changes. It changes depending on if I meet a new plant or there's like an old plant that I meet again and I'm like, oh, I forgot about you, old friend. But I'll say right now is Pelargonium capitatum. And the reason why that plant comes to mind, one, it's from my PhD program, but I did a lot of field work where I would look at these old herbarium records, collect GPS points, and basically go out to these GPS points, see if the plants were still there. If they were there, collect some information on them. And so looking around South Africa for Pelargonium capitatum, this plant grows in these beautiful settings. I'm talking about off the coastlines, on a beach. There's mountains in the background, like the beach meets the mountains sort of thing. I've just been to some fabulous, fabulous field sites looking for Pelargonium capitatum and some really peaceful and restorative field sites looking for this plant. So that one kind of stands out to me. And it also has fuzzy leaves like the African violet.
Full circle.
Yeah.
Oh, that just sounds incredibly, incredibly beautiful. And I can only imagine some of the places you've gotten to see from from the rainforest to the beaches of South Africa. I mean, plants can literally take you anywhere. So just thank you so much for sharing your story today. You know, I really appreciate the advice you've given on the whole confusing process of academia. You know, and your story is great because it really shows, the importance of taking advantage of opportunities, building your experiences, and, all of this is ultimately leading you to be a leader in the botanical world community. So we are so grateful you took the time to talk to us, and just thank you so much for sharing.
Of course. Thank you so much for inviting me. I love the podcast. It's been so much fun.
This episode of Planted, Finding Your Roots in STEM Careers, was made possible by the Morton Arboretum and the Multimedia Services at College of DuPage. Check out additional resources and bonus content at www.mortonarb.org/plantedpodcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, like, and share. This is Jessica Turner-Scuff
and Megan Wiesbrook,
and we hope you'll continue to join us as we journey into STEM careers.